So, ready to start?
Yeah.
Okay, so we have now Esteban with a Game Boy and his cell phone.
Hello, and thanks for being here for this talk about Game Boy peripheral that I think is very interesting and versatile. I am Esteban, and I've been working to emulate and restore this peripheral for on and off for the last 6 years or so. But first, I should tell you what it is. The Mobile Adapter GB is a peripheral that allows you to connect your Game Boy up to a cell phone, allowing games to make and receive calls, in part to also call an internet service provider and connect to the internet, allowing for all sorts of online connectivity, like sharing scores and getting updates for various things. It was one of the very first attempts by Nintendo to have any sort of online connectivity for their consoles, but what makes this one very interesting, in my opinion, is that it supported a few rather high-profile games. There were actually a few variations of this adapter made for several different phones. You have a blue, a yellow, and a red one. The green one for PHS was also planned but never released. But what you will notice is that none of these actually work for any non-Japanese phones. So this service never left the island. And unfortunately, it was sunset very early, almost 2 years into its life in December 2002. But to give you a better idea of what this peripheral could do, we will talk a little bit about the games that supported it. So first of all, you got the mobile trainer with the adapter. It was used to configure the adapter, and you had to use this before you could connect to the internet. It also came with a very useful usage manual, but it also had some very interesting utilities, which were a mail client which supported both SMTP and POP, and could communicate with the outside world, so you could actually receive real emails. And a very minimal web browser, which was hard-coded to one website to read news about Nintendo games and games for this peripheral. Now, the very first game that was released for this thing was Pokémon, a very popular franchise that I'm sure you're familiar with. But it was actually one of the very first time you were able to battle and trade online with your friends, or at very large distances at least. Besides that, it also featured a battle tower which allowed you to fight people who have entered that tower previously. It got localized with NPCs in the West, but the Japanese version worked with this adapter. You also had a trade corner, which is a bit of a prototype of the global trade station, which appeared back in Generation 4. And you had a news machine, which I think is the most interesting part, because you could download scripts which had news items, but also mini games, questionnaires, and you had rankings to show off your friends how big your Magikarp is. Another very interesting game, in my opinion, is Net the Get, which was one of the only title which used the MBC6 on the Game Boy. It's a minigame collection that came with 15 built-in minigames, but you could download more, and more would be released over time, though they never reached the titular 100 minigames, unfortunately. A few other games that were very interesting: Mobile Golf, which is a sequel to Mario Golf, which never got localized, but it came bundled with the adapter later in its life to help sell the adapter. Starcom, which is a sort of pet simulator. Game Boy Wars, which was part of the Wars series, known for Advance Wars and Famicom Wars. And Mario Kart, which allowed you to upload and download ghost data. So let's tell you a little bit about how this project got started and where we are now. Yes. Somewhere in 2016, Hacky posted a thread on Glitch City Labs, which explained a little bit about how the mobile adapter protocol worked. From there, we spun up a Python script which communicated with the BGB emulator, allowing you to have a proof concept that this thing actually worked. Somewhere in 2018, a guy named Shonumi, who is known for emulating various peripherals, including sewing machines and fishing sonars, which were made for the Game Boy, also emulated the MOBA adapter and specifically NetToGet, and created very comprehensive documentation that we are updating and keeping track of to this day. And at some point, people wanted to actually bring a real Game Boy to connect to the internet, and that's kind of where I stepped in and we started doing stuff. So fast forward to today, we have a group called REON. We are a group of preservationists, developers, and enthusiasts who want to preserve this system and make it usable to the common user as it used to be. For that, we are making emulators, servers, and translations for a few of the games so that they can be enjoyed by a wider audience. So to give you an idea of how this all fits together, I will explain a bit about how the system connects together. So this is a connection diagram. On the left side, you have the user's Game Boy, which communicates through through a custom link protocol with the adapter, which further communicates with a proprietary protocol with the mobile phone. The mobile phone is connected to the phone network, but depending on who you call, you can either call a friend and communicate with their phone directly, and this was used, for example, for the Pokémon trading and battling. Or you could call the internet service provider and use the point-to-point protocol to tunnel your connection through TCP and UDP to the official Nintendo servers. Now, most of this stuff is kind of irrelevant when we're emulating this, because when we're emulating it, we can kind of make big black boxes depending on what you're doing. This is how it would look if you have a simple microcontroller that connects to your Game Boy and then further connects through USB to your computer. Your computer will communicate to either the game server, or if you want to call a friend, then we have set up a relay to punch through router firewalls and that sort of thing, which allows you to connect to any other player on the world. And this can either be hardware, or it can be, these blocks can either be a full emulator, which also emulates like the Game Boy itself and the adapter. So it's a little bit more variable. So we have full documentation and emulation of the peripheral itself, at least the part that communicates with the Game Boy. And for that, we have made a library called libmobile. This library can be integrated into all sorts of projects, from software emulators to hardware emulators and back. We've integrated it thus far into the BGB emulator, which is a Game Boy Color emulator. We've integrated it into the GBA emulator. We've made a little fun interface to configure it as well. And some people have been playing around with making it work on the Raspberry Pi Pico and communicating over Wi-Fi, for example, or the Arduino Uno, which is mostly what I've been using. There's also the GBE Plus emulator, which was made by the Shonumi, which I mentioned before. This is more of a local-only emulator, but it supports some games that we don't yet. And of course, full documentation of this is available in Dan Docs. So these are a few of the examples of things, of setups that people have put together. On the far left, you've got the simplest one, which is just breaking out a few wires and connecting them to the Arduino, and then just plugging that into your computer and doing it like that. Some people have made PCBs. The central one is able to communicate over Wi-Fi. And Zenaro, really active user lately, has made a 3D printed version of it as well. Now, of course, you don't need to connect it directly to a computer. You can also just use a modern phone, which are basically computers these days. We've also, of course, started emulating the server side of things. We have the relay server, which I've mentioned before, which gives you a phone number and allows you to call someone else. We have the mail server. We have a mail server which is implemented in Node.js and stores in SQL, so we can access it more easily, so we can manipulate the emails more easily. And we have a few complete game servers for Pokemon Crystal, which supports actually everything at this point. And a very driven person called Winter, who has fully emulated Mario Kart and Monopoly, though Monopoly doesn't have many features, unfortunately. Also, GBE Plus has emulated a few games, in particular Net to Get, Game Boy Wars, All Japan GT Championship, and Hello Kitty's Happy House, which allowed you to send emails with items to your friends, which is very cute, I think. And of course, we've also made a few translations. In particular, Pokemon Crystal, of course, was already localized, but we've restored all the functionality for it. And we've also ported all of those changes to the four other languages that the game was released for. Mark Max came to us asking if we were interested in his mobile golf translation. And most of it has been translated, but not the mobile features because we don't have any support for it yet. And the mobile trainer, which of course is the cornerstone of this whole thing. If you want to get into it or make an emulator for yourself or develop a game that supports this thing, we have, of course, libmobile, which allows you to emulate the adapter itself. We have the REON repository, which you can extend with other games, or if you want to emulate those, though I would suggest if you make homebrew that you make your own server behind this. And unfortunately, we still don't have a client library, the library that runs on the Game Boy itself, though we have reverse engineered the library from the Nintendo SDK if you don't care about licensing problems. So in conclusion, most of the things that you'd want to see are already there. Of course, we don't have all the games yet. The problem that we're mostly struggling with right now is authentication and getting this useful for actual people who aren't very techy. So if you want to help with any of that, documentation, making tools, websites, whatever, you can reach us on, unfortunately, Discord only. If you want to make a Matrix server and bridge that, I would be very happy. But unfortunately, right now, I would be the only person who would use that. Our GitHub is over there, and Shonumi's blog with a lot of more peripherals and funky things that he's emulated with the Game Boy can be reached through his GitHub pages. That was it. Thank you.
We have time for one or two quick questions.
I have a very quick question. Thanks for the talk. Do you know how the original games that you could download over the internet back in the 2000s, how those were captured?
Have what?
How those have been captured that's 22 years ago?
No.
Are they?
So one of the things that we actually sometimes need help with is if you have any of the games that supported the mobile adapter, don't run them, dump the save directly. If the battery still lives, then we might be able to restore some of the games that were supported back then. Thankfully, though, we have the 15 built-in games which serve as an example to make more, so that helps a lot already.
Another quick question? Yes? No? No. Okay. Well, then, thank you. get prepared.
It was a really interesting talk. Thank you.
Thank you.